there is a need to make decision to cut through all these fog, all of those uncertainties and ambiguities, and make a decision, follow it, and having the courage to take this decision, then the strength to execute it.
We are back on the Spin Room. That was Ehud Barak speaking about an event that took place years earlier, just after midnight on September 6, 2007. Back then, he was defense minister, and that night, the balance of power in the Middle East changed dramatically when Israeli fighter jets destroyed a Syrian nuclear reactor just before it became hot. But there was foot dragging, intelligence failures, and plenty of arguments at top levels before the jets flew out. And who better to talk about it all than with the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, Yaakov Katz, on his new book, Shadow Strike: Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power. Yaakov, thank you very much for coming on the Spin Room. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Looks like the book is doing great. I want to show some quotes that you put on the back cover there. One is from Dick Cheney. He says it is a blueprint for how countries can and should act when faced with a threat of an existential nature. And from Newt Gingrich, remarkable, one of the most compelling stories I have read in a long time. Great reviews already off the bat there. Tell us a bit about the background first. It's 2007. You have Assad in Syria and Ehud Olmert as Israeli prime minister. What else should we know about the situation that was before this attack?
Well, the context is extremely important, as you point out, Ami, because what you had was we're just a year. Well, we're actually in April, when Israel discovers the reactor, we're just 8 months after the Second Lebanon War ended. And it ended, as you'll recall, it didn't end well, right? There was a commission of inquiry. There were calls for Olmert to resign. The chief of staff, Dan Chalitz, had already stepped down. Amir Peretz, the defense minister, there were calls for him to resign. Throughout all levels of the government and the IDF, they discovered flaws and failures in the decision-making process, in the orders that were handed down to the soldiers in Lebanon. And then suddenly this lands on their table. A nuclear reactor being built not in some faraway country, Iraq, like in '81 when Israel destroyed it, or Iran, which we've been dealing with for so long, but in Israel's backyard, just over the border in Syria. This is something Israel should have known about, and this changes everything. Because if we're starting to just rehabilitate and repair and rebuild the army, now we have this real existential threat just over the border. So that's one. Two is, let's not forget that Ehud Olmert, similar kind of today to our current Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu.
Some legal troubles.
Yeah, also was facing legal troubles. As a matter of fact, and I tell in the book, when he gets the first intelligence information, the photos of this nuclear reactor that the Mossad had obtained in a raid in Vienna, and they're brought and they're put on his desk in Jerusalem, there's a knock at the door. And he says to the people, this is the first time he's learning about this, and he says, go away. And the knock persists, and opens the door his spokesperson, and says, and the Prime Minister says, get the hell out of here. And he said, the spokesperson says to him, but there's going to be a report in about an hour on one of the main news channels in Israel about another criminal investigation being opened against you. So as he's realizing that the world has changed forever for him, he also has to deal with these criminal investigations.
So you have that. You have the Second Lebanon War, seen by many as a failure. You have the legal troubles. Is that part of the decision-making process? Does that push Ehud Olmert to act?
It's a great question, and I'm not a psychologist and I don't know. But what I do think is that we could have said the opposite. He's got the legal troubles. He's got the problems of the Second Lebanon War, and he has a U.S. president, George Bush, who he goes to and asks him to take action and to stop Syria. And George Bush, after months, and in the book I tell the story of what goes on in Washington. There are debates, and we could talk about that, but ultimately Bush decides not to attack. Olmert easily could have said, I'm going to go with the Americans.
Right.
I have my legal troubles. I'm afraid of another war with Syria, after especially the bad war we just had with Lebanon and Hezbollah. Why risk it all? Why gamble? I have the cover of the U.S. president. But he didn't. So was there a political calculation there possibly that maybe he thought he could rehabilitate his career on the heels of this nuclear reactor strike? Maybe, but the problem with that theory is that Israel never spoke about it. So he was never able to take credit for something that's amazing, but that would have maybe given him political benefit, but he can never talk about it.
You kind of raised it just very quickly, but I want you to talk a little more about it, because later on there were some intelligence battles between the Mossad and the Army intelligence claiming, you know, who should have known about this reactor. Where do you stand on this? Was this an intelligence failure?
I think it needs to be looked at as an intelligence failure from the mere fact that Israel discovered this in March of 2007, almost by fluke. There were suspicions in
just a few months before it was supposed to.
There was a narrow window before it was supposed to be activated and go hot. And once the fuel rods are there, and that reactor is active. And the reactor is just about 1 kilometer from the Euphrates River, and it gets attacked after it's active. You have radioactive material that falls into the Euphrates River, a river that flows through Syria and Iraq and beyond. You could potentially contaminate generations to come of people in the region. That's something that Israel would not have so easily been able to do. So they had that narrow window, but it was under construction for years. How did they not pick up on it beforehand? Yeah. And I think that's the failure. Now, who exactly was responsible? Was it the Mossad? Was it military intelligence?
We don't have an answer till this day, do we?
I don't think we have an answer to this day, and it depends who you ask. As you know, oftentimes, if I ask people in the Mossad, they were great. Right. I asked people in military intelligence, if it wasn't for them, we never would have discovered it.
Well, here's another $1 million question. Had Israel not carried out this mission, what would the Middle East look like today?
That's an amazing question, because this reactor was destroyed in 2007. It was being built by North Korea for Syria. In 2011, civil war breaks out in Syria, right? In 2014, the region where that reactor used to be, situated called Deir ez-Zor in northeastern Syria, is taken over by ISIS, right? Now, imagine for a moment Israel had never learned of the reactor, had never destroyed the reactor. Assad kept it, still was a secret, the world never knew, and one day ISIS takes over Deir ez-Zor and gets their hands, maybe not on a nuclear weapon, but radioactive material. You'd have little dirty bombs in suitcases flying around the world throughout airports and capital cities.
Well, one could say you don't even have to go so far as ISIS. I mean, look at Assad. He used chemical weapons against his own people. I mean, is this the kind of guy, do you think, who might have been able to use, trigger happy maybe, to use a nuclear weapon?
So I raised that question in the book. I don't know the answer to it, but you know what? You mentioned Ehud Barak before. Ehud Barak was the guy who was defense minister. I remember because I was the military reporter covering him at the time, who said that Assad's going to fall within weeks in the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring or the uprising. Yep. He never fell. Assad surprised the world, and when you look back now on 8 years of the civil war, he showed everyone he wasn't weak. He didn't hesitate to use force, and not only force, but brutal force and chemical weapons. If he had nuclear weapons, would he have used it even against his own people? Would he have used it against Israel to distract what was happening in Syria to someone else? Anything's possible.
How does this mission, this one in 2007, differ from the earlier attack in Osirak in Iraq in 1980 or 81? Excuse me. 81. Or maybe a possible future attack in Iran. What makes this one different?
I'll tell you, it's similar to the sense to Iraq. Iraq was farther away, but they were both single facilities above ground, fairly easy to take out once you're over them from an aerial strike. Iran, in contrast, has scattered its facilities throughout the country, some of them buried deep underground in heavy fortified facilities, like Natanz or Qom, where they like to enrich uranium. Yeah. So that makes a conventional strike a little more complicated. But where it's different than Osirak is that in 1981, when Menachem Begin sent those jets to bomb Saddam's reactor, America condemned Israel. Israel was condemned in the UN Security Council. Ronald Reagan, who was then the president, suspended the delivery of fighter jets to Israel because of how upset the U.S. administration was at the time. Here, in comparison, in 2007 against Syria, Israel worked hand in hand with the Americans. Israel came to America, brought them those photos that they uncovered in that Vienna raid, showed them to the president, the CIA, the head of the CIA, the vice president Cheney, all the other people, and they began a process of their own to consider what they should do, because they recognize this is not just a little Israel problem. This is a global threat.
Right.
So there was more partnership and more cooperation.
So you mentioned that Iran's weapons are now really spread out and they're very deep. I mean, we're seeing very high tensions right now in the Persian Gulf between the United States and Iran. One could argue maybe that an Israeli attack earlier on in Iran, or maybe an American attack earlier on, and we could have avoided what we're seeing right now. No?
It's possible. I think that Israel recognizes the complexity of a bombing against Iran. And we know there have been reports over the years that there were a couple of times that Netanyahu tried to get his generals to prepare for a possible operation
with Ehud Barak.
With Ehud Barak, who was also then defense minister. Right, and one of those cases was in 2010, and I even tell that story, and I make that comparison between what happened in 2010 and happened in 2007. But I think that Iran, because of the scale, because of the complexity, because of the distance, and because of the retaliation. When Israel bombed Syria in 2007, they thought of what they called the deniability zone. Because Assad kept it a secret from all his people, Israel felt that if they don't talk about it, which they didn't for over 10 years, Assad won't be embarrassed and he'll just sweep it under the rug. And that's pretty much what he did. In 1981, Iraq was too far away to retaliate. This time, Iran, by itself has ballistic missiles to reach Israel, and it could activate its main proxy, Hezbollah, which would change everything for Israel. So all of that together makes Israel calculate differently and try to really reach a diplomatic solution, a better deal than the one that they are currently in, the 2015 deal. Israel wants, like Trump, for there just to be a better deal.
So let's talk about the diplomatic solution now, at least, and about the brinkmanship that Donald Trump is waging now. Here's what he said to Fox News about a possible war with Iran.
The deal that President Obama made was a horror show, the Iran nuclear deal, because basically it says that in 5 years from now, they're going to have an open path to making nuclear weapons. We don't need another country with that. Can't be threatening us. And, you know, with all of everything that's going on, and I'm not one that believes, you know, I'm not somebody that wants to go into war.
Somebody doesn't want to go to war with Iran, but yesterday he goes to Twitter and he says, if Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again. Mixed signals, no?
Well, that's Donald Trump for you, right? It's classic Trump. But I think
is that the way to play with the foreign policy? I mean, some say the Iranians are maybe even calling out Donald Trump's bluff. Is he playing this right?
It's possible, but also you'll see the similarity, Ami, to what he did with North Korea, right? In the beginning, he said, we'll obliterate North Korea. He called him Rocket Man, right? You know, we'll be met by fire and all that kind of stuff. And then suddenly they're holding summits and they're trying to reach a peaceful solution. This is Trump's way of doing foreign diplomacy, right? He holds a big carrot and he also tries to hold a big stick. It's up to that country whether they want to call his bluff or not. I think with Iran, the difference right here is that with the new sanctions that the U.S. has imposed, the taking away the waivers for the oil sales and now in the energy and metal sector, that's hurting them hard. And that's hitting the streets of Tehran and across the country. That's what would be the main initiative or incentive for the Iranians to come back to the table.
But it hasn't brought regime change, and they're, on the other hand, relaxing their restrictions against the nuclear program, so maybe those sanctions are actually backfiring.
Well, everyone's playing a game, and it's a game of chicken. Who's gonna blink first?
Who do you think is going to blink first?
I would guess that no one wants a war at the moment, right? I think because two reasons why. One, Trump doesn't want a war for sure. And number two is that the Iranians, they want one thing, and that's the survival of the Ayatollahs and the regime. Yeah. And they know that a war, and I don't think he's bluffing here. If there were to be a war with Trump, with the United States, America has capabilities that we in Israel can only, dream about, but they could really destroy the regime and destroy all of the nuclear facilities, all the national infrastructure. They don't want that. So I think they'll try to find a way down from this. The question is whether we'll get a better deal than the one that's currently on the table, the one that the U.S. pulled out of.
We just have a minute left before we go. I want to ask you about the details that we're hearing about the deal of the century. This economic conference in Bahrain that we talked about earlier with my other pundits. What do you think? Do you think he has some kind of ace up his sleeve that he could actually do this?
He's the most unpredictable president that I think we've known, at least in my lifetime and probably your lifetime. So if anyone has that ace, it would be Donald Trump. I'm highly skeptical. I'm skeptical because there's complete disconnect with the Palestinians. I don't know how you bridge between Ramallah and Washington, D.C. And also the government that might be built right now by Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is going to be a narrow right-wing government if he succeeds. How do they stomach the establishment of a Palestinian state? Exactly. So there's a lot of problems here, but we'll see.
Yaakov Katz, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and author of Shadow Strike. Good luck with the book. Thank you very much for coming on the Spin Room. It's an honor to host you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That's it. Hope you enjoyed watching. Thanks for taking a ride with us on the Spin Room. Hope you hop on again every Monday and Thursday, 4 p.m. New York, 11 p.m. in Tel Aviv. In the meantime, hang in there.